May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Throughout the scriptures, God is described as, and sometimes introduces God's self as, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are often considered to be the three pillar ancestors of our faith. Throughout the summer, we have been hearing the stories of these great ancestors. We started with Abraham as Abram, and heard stories about his renaming to Abraham as he followed in faith when God told him to leave his homeland and go. We heard the story of Sarah's barrenness, her desire for children. We heard the story of Hagar, of Isaac. We begin today to hear the story of the third of those. We've heard Abraham's story a bit. We've heard a bit of Isaac's story. Today, we continue with Jacob's story, which we started last week. Now, if you remember last week, we heard about the birth of Jacob and Esau, who were twins. And when Rebecca, the story tells us that when Rebecca was pregnant, there was a lot happening, and she said, "What is going on?" And God told her, 2 nations are at war within your womb. The younger will serve the older, which that's not how things go. Indeed, when they were born, Esau was born first, but when he came out, Jacob was holding on to his heel. Esau is described as growing up to be a hunter, and Jacob as a quiet man living in tents. At the end of last week's reading, we had the story where Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a pot of stew. He was out hunting, came in famished, and there was food, and said, "I'll sell you my birthright, just give me something to eat." And the birthright was the right of the firstborn son to be the heir and head of the household when the father died. The younger brother would get something, but the chunk of the inheritance would go to the older brother. And Esau gave it to Jacob for a pot of soup. At the end of that reading, we also had the little note that Isaac loved Esau, but Rachel loved Jacob. Now, today's reading picks up when it says that Jacob is on the way and he came to a certain place. But there's another very important story that happens between those two. See, in between those two stories, we have the story of when Isaac was getting old and his eyesight was getting dim, and not just because the lights weren't working. Sorry, y'all, we're working on getting those fixed. His eyesight was getting dim, and he wanted to give the blessing of the oldest child to Esau, because there was the birthright and there was also the blessing of the elder son. And so, although he had given away his birthright, Isaac could still give Esau his blessing. And so he told him to go hunting, get some food, prepare that game that I love that so much, and come and we'll eat and I'll give you my blessing. But Rebecca overheard this, and she concocted a plan with Jacob to steal that blessing. She cooked. She put some of Esau's clothes on him. She put some of his clothes on his arms. Because see, Esau was kind of a hairy, rough dude, but Jacob was more fine and refined. And so Rebecca helped him feel like, so that when Isaac touched him, he's like, "Oh, okay, I mean, you sound like Jacob, but you kind of smell like Esau, and you're hairy," so Isaac gave the blessing to Jacob, the younger son. And so when Esau came in from this tiring hunting and cooking, said, "Father, I'm here for my blessing," he said, oops, I already gave it to Jacob. And Esau was enraged, so much so that he wanted to kill his brother. And so Rebekah took Jacob and said, "Go to my father Laban's house. Go and stay there for a while until your brother's not so mad anymore." And that's where we pick up. We pick up Jacob fleeing from his brother's wrath. We pick up with Jacob fresh off of another instance of trickery and betrayal, and yet God shows up in a special way to him in this moment. As we look at today's reading and reflect on this particular part of Jacob's story, I find myself continuing to wonder about and sit with those unexpected encounters with God on the way, and how I deal with those and how I manage those, and is there a way to begin to expect the unexpected? See, the first thing that really jumped out to me is that it doesn't matter where you're coming from, what you may be running away from, what you may be running to. God might still show up. Now, I doubt anyone here is running away from somebody who's trying to kill them. I hope you're not. But each one of us in our lives has some kind of struggle that we are dealing with or coming out of dealing with. Each one of us in our lives have some part of our journey throughout our lives when we look back where we didn't expect that God would show up when we were in this place. We have those moments where in the place of our lowliness, in the place of our brokenness, God still shows up. And these places are often ordinary places until we have those encounters and until we notice them. In the psalm we heard, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I climb up to heaven, you are there. If I make the grave my bed, you are there also. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me." So we know that God's presence is all around us, but oftentimes we don't notice it. Perhaps it's in the vulnerability of sleep. Perhaps it's in that state of running for his life that Jacob was open to the presence of God that was indeed and is indeed all around us. What statue of heart do we need to be able to more often notice those places where God shows up? I find that in my life, I don't have a whole lot of places where in that moment I was able to declare, this is the house of God. One of the things that amazes me about this particular story is that as soon as he woke up, he said, God was here. There was a dream, and he said, this is the house of God. For me, most of the time, I recognize God's presence, I recognize encounters with God when I'm looking back after the fact. But what is it? What might allow us to more fully and more frequently notice when God shows up in those ordinary times, in those day-to-day moments of our lives? How do we notice God showing up? I mean, sure, there are places where we go when we expect God to show up. We expect to have an encounter with God when we come to worship. We expect to have an encounter with God on pilgrimages to holy sites. We expect to have an encounter with God in a lot of relationships in our lives. But in those that we don't expect, why don't we expect God to show up? Why don't we expect an encounter with God when we're annoyed and waiting in the line at the grocery store? Why don't we expect an encounter with God when we are tired and hungry and one more person asks you for something? Why don't we expect an encounter with God in those day-to-day times when we're just going through our routine? Perhaps it's because we didn't stop long enough and stay and tarry a while. When we do notice, what then do we do about it? When Jacob woke up after his dream and his encounter with God, he said and declared, "Surely the Lord is in this place." And he took oil, which was very expensive and a very valuable commodity, and poured it on the stone where he was sleeping, and declared, "This is the house of God, Bethel." How do we mark those places in our lives, those people in our lives that have blessed us with unexpected encounters with God? How do we as a community honor one another when we provide each other those Bethel moments? How do we honor and say and mark for those to come after us, this is the place of God? Indeed, for generations after Jacob, Bethel was a place revered for worship. How do we leave a legacy of pointing out, hey, God is showing up here, not just in this building, but in the world around us? What does it look like for us to mark Bethel in the park when we have feeding in the park? This is the house of God. What would it look like for us to mark Bethel as we go shopping for our backpacks? This is the house of God. What does it look like for us to mark each other as the presence of God with us? As we continue with the narratives of these ancestors of our faith, there are many different aspects of our faith journey that we will be invited to sit with for a little bit. But today the question is, how do we prepare ourselves to have encounters with God in unexpected places, in those ordinary places? And what do we do to mark them? How do we together as a community proclaim, not just in this building, but in the world around us, that surely the presence of the Lord is in this place? Amen.